So welcome to today's podcast, and thanks for joining on a Friday morning. This is the third episode. I'm Jose Almeida. I'm a vascular surgeon down here in Miami, also a gym owner and competitive bodybuilder, thus the name Miami Med Gym Podcast. This is our third episode, and today's I'm going to go more through a PowerPoint. The first two I had some folks join me and we did an interview style, but today it's going to be a little more wonky in the terms of we'll get into the cell and some biochemistry on how we extract energy from food. And then these concepts on the left, maybe not in this order, we'll kind of touch on these macro and micronutrients, what they are, what mitochondria are, ATP, our energy currency, the membrane potential or electricity that runs within us, insulin and glucose and metabolic syndrome, and why we need a healthy gut, which we also touched on the last couple episodes. These are posted on our new YouTube channel as Miami Med Gym Podcast. So if today gets a little long, then just, you can watch it on demand later on YouTube. So that's the idea as we build this. When I bought and I own a gym called Rip Gym 6 years ago, and there are some videos on the Ripped Gym, RYPT Gym channel. So I'm kind of picking up from 6 years ago with a more formal podcast, more for educational purposes, as we go through this. So we have a gym in Midtown Miami, and I've got some trainers in my medical office in Brickell. We've combined the two, thus the concept medical gym, where we're trying to help folks with wellness, and we are building a team. By the way, the next slide here, on Monday, we'll be doing another podcast at 8 p.m. and some team members, Dr. Laura Ellis, Yaxini Orquin, and Ben Miner will join me as we talk about meal prepping. So these are the types of topics we'll be going through as we progress. But today, let's talk about extracting energy from food. And just to start, this is all in the spirit of developing a balanced life. And this is my family, my wife of 30 years, and my 4 kids that I'm very proud of, all college graduates now. This is at Duke University when Alexis was graduating. So as we develop the podcast, we'll also be talking about mindset and habits and the spiritual side of things, emotional side of things, not just wonky biochemistry like we'll talk about today. So try and bear with me. I'll try and give some big picture concepts as we go through this that hopefully will be some take-home messages that you can execute on your own. But as we know, people have a hard time with nutrition, and we have this epidemic of metabolic syndrome, and that's what we're trying to help with this Med Gym, the importance of nutrition and exercise. So we take food in, and metabolism really is the sum of anabolism, or making things, synthesizing things, and catabolism, or breakdown. So metabolism is synthesis and breakdown, both of which occur simultaneously throughout our lives. It's necessary for life. So first we take in food, we break it down. This will deliver some energy, and since we're not completely efficient systems, some is released as heat, which is where calories come from, which we won't go into today. But the idea, we break down the food into its 3 macronutrients, and then we reassemble them in the body for whatever use that we need. So that's really the idea of food. And again, metabolic syndrome, why does this occur? That's what we're going to go through a little bit today. So you take in food, we chew it in the mouth, saliva starts working on it. It goes down the esophagus, through the stomach, through the small intestine, through the colon, out the anus. So this tube is really outside of our body. This tube within us is outside of our body. And it's lined with a lot of bacteria, fungi, viruses that we call the microbiota, which has our microbiome. Microbiota are all the bugs, and the microbiome is genetic information within the bugs. We have about 37 trillion cells of ours, and the microbiota, the numbers vary that I've read, but between 50 and 100 trillion. So we're truly coexist with bacteria or bugs, and we'll touch on that at the very end of the talk. The microbiome, we've talked about it before in the previous episodes. So carbohydrates, proteins, fats, these are our macronutrients. You've seen this sort of thing before. This is what goes in our mouth. And then using things like enzymes, amylase sucrase would be helping digest carbohydrates, pepsin help digest proteins, lipase to help break down fats. And ultimately, these go to form our basic building blocks, which are glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids and glycerol. See if they get this advanced. When we talk about a cell, this is a cell. Again, we have 37 trillion of these. Cell membranes contain cytoplasm, which we'll talk about a lot today, the mitochondria, which we'll talk about, and then our nucleus is where our DNA resides. The DNA is our genetic information that codes for everything that we make. So a lot of the proteins come from nuclear information. So the DNA transcribes it to messenger RNA and then translates it to protein for protein synthesis. So that's a lot going on here, which we won't really talk about today. Today, we're going to focus on the mitochondria and the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is where anaerobic glycolysis occurs, mitochondria where aerobic respiration occurs. And hopefully this will make a little more sense in a few minutes. Epigenetics is a term that we use at our DNA based on our environmental feedback. We can actually turn on and turn off genes. So this is why people look differently and different functions is because the DNA are modifiable, and environmental as well as genetic factors play a big role in how we behave and function. So this will be kind of the crux of what we're going to talk about today. Here's a food source. Polysaccharides are carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, the three macronutrients. These get broken down. Down here, glycolysis means the breakdown of sugar without oxygen. And again, we've already taken a carbohydrate, broken it down in the gut, and we absorb it as the building block glucose through the small intestine into the bloodstream, which then goes to the liver or whichever cells are necessary. Glucose then starts getting broken down. Glucose is a carbon skeleton, will start getting broken down to ultimately produce ATP. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is our energy currency. That's what gives us energy. So all this idea here is to make ATP and give us energy. Fats are a storage form of energy, but fats get broken down into a glycerol backbone and fatty acids. Glycerol can enter glycolysis, or the fatty acids can enter the mitochondria to produce acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA goes to the citric acid cycle, and I know this is starting to get a little confusing, and ultimately the electron transport chain for oxidative phosphorylation. All right, so what the hell does all this stuff mean? Sugars are mostly used for energy. Fats are mostly used for the storage of energy. Proteins, the building block of which are amino acids, are mostly for our structural structure, like, for example, collagen in bones or enzymes or all types of proteins that we make. Amino acids can also be used for energy. Again, amino acids, these are all carbon skeletons, carbon meaning organic. So all these carbon skeletons can be repurposed for whatever the body's asking for. So if we need to break down protein to make energy in cases of starvation, our body can do that. If we need to store energy, it will go as fat. If we need to burn fat, which is what we want to do for body composition purposes, we can't have much glucose around. All right, so that let's see if we can help explain this a little better. This is just showing this occurs in the mitochondria, and this is in the cytoplasm. Remember the slide I showed you about the cell. This is just to show that that Krebs cycle, this is everything that goes around it, metabolism, from our DNA, our DNA is ribonucleotides, the carbon skeletons and nitrogen, which make that up. That's part sugar, part carbon. Our fats metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, protein metabolism, all these molecules are carbon skeletons and nitrogen that get reshuffled for our purposes. And there's an argument that the Krebs cycle, which is what we're going to focus on today, is the main player of this metabolism. So back to carbohydrates. Again, when we take the food stuff in, it's more in the complex form, like a starch or a fiber. Sugars, the broken down form. So this is one glucose molecule. If you link a sucrose to a glucose, you get sucrose here as a two ring structure, whereas multiple rings is a more complex structure like starch and fiber. When we eat starch and fiber, this gets broken down slowly and glucose is released into our system slowly. When we eat pure sugar, it gets into the system quickly. And if you can't control sugar, that's really the definition of diabetes. So sugar in the bloodstream for extended periods of time is toxic to us. So we need to be able to dispose of sugar and use it quickly. And again, sugar is really used for the release of energy. Fats, this would be what a fat molecule, so the glycerol backbone, a carbon backbone with oxygen and hydrogen. These are the fatty acids. These are just kind of schematics, so you get a sense of what things look like in their basic structures. But I would just call this carbon skeleton with hydrogen. Carbon is the bone and oxygen. So carbohydrate, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is throughout our system, and the way it's shuffled and what goes with it. For example, you add nitrogen to this, we start talking about proteins and nucleic acids of DNA. But the idea here is that this is what fat molecules look like. They help create our cell membranes, and they can be used for energy storage. Proteins get broken down to amino acids, and a protein would be a carbon skeleton with a nitrogen or amine group and a carboxyl group. Amino acids get assembled to form peptides, which then polypeptides, which a protein is multiple peptides structured together, and they usually fold up like this. So they're a little more complex. And again, proteins are really used for growth and repair. There's 20 amino acids. 7 of which are essential, meaning we have to get them from the outside, from the diet. The other ones we can actually make inside of our body by, again, reshuffling carbon skeletons and maybe using parts from other areas as needed by the body. So very versatile, our bodies for making energy. This is just to show the importance of protein. So when we talk about a diet, the first thing is to calculate your calories based on your basal metabolic rate, or it's really total energy expenditure. So basal metabolic rate thermic effect of food, exercise, and non-exercise activity. So I don't want to get into all that, but basically we have a basal rate of calories that we burn just being sedentary. So say, take me for example, I'm around 3,200, let's call it 3,000 calories is my baseline. So when I calculate my diet, I want 3,000 calories a day. How am I going to break that up? The first thing I'm going to do is my protein. So I want, me personally, about 200 grams of protein a day. I like a high protein diet. And then I'll balance out the remaining calories with carbohydrates and fats. So that's the basic principle. But you eat a meal, when you eat your meal, protein synthesis, so we're talking about muscle protein synthesis, is based on meal timing. So you eat your food, this will immediately activate protein synthesis. If you're doing exercise, it'll even activate it more. But each meal is responsible for protein synthesis. So then this gets into meal timing, meal size, amount of protein per meal. It's a mixed meal, and this will also play a role in how you metabolize things. There's a lot to unpack inside of this. This is a whole talk in and of itself, so I don't want to go down that road right now, but suffice it to say, calories first, then your protein, and then you balance out your fats and carbohydrates when you're running a diet. So back to this, hopefully it'll start coming together a little bit as you keep seeing it in different formats. So let's talk about glucose. In the cytoplasm, under anaerobic conditions without oxygen, you can make some ATP. When it enters the mitochondria, now we're talking about aerobic conditions, it needs oxygen and it'll generate more ATP. So in the cytoplasm by itself, one molecule of glucose will only generate 2 ATP, whereas when you go into the mitochondria and use oxygen, it can produce 38 ATP. And how does it do that? There's an important molecule called NADH. So for every rotation of the cycle, and we'll look at the enzymes in a second, you make NADH, which basically is your electron carrier, which goes to the electron transport chain, donates the electrons to oxygen, and this goes on to make ATP. So oxidative phosphorylation, big word to say that adding phosphorus to this molecule is what makes ATP, and under conditions of oxygen. So this is why everybody knows we have to take in oxygen and we blow off CO2. This is respiration right here. Taking in oxygen, burning our food, and it goes off of CO2 and water. Okay, so that's where all that comes, what you hear. And then it's amazing that our organism, what you call our body, is pretty consistent as we're taking in food all day long, breaking it down, reassembling it, and it goes off in in the urine and in the breath, CO2, and of course excreting feces. But this is what we call respiration. As we break down a glucose molecule, fats can also go through a process of beta oxidation, which will produce what's called acetyl-CoA at this step. So fats can enter the Krebs cycle and also produce ATP through the same mechanisms of generating NADH in the Krebs cycle. Okay, so hopefully that's getting a little clearer. Now, the reason I show this slide, this is the Krebs cycle again, that same circle. And now you start seeing acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon combining with a 4-carbon called oxaloacetate, forming a 6-carbon called citrate. This is why the Krebs cycle is also called the citric acid cycle. But what I'm trying to show here, so these are the molecules involved in this cycle as we give off NADH down here that we talked about. But look here, so our micronutrients, vitamin Bs, magnesium. This is why we need vitamins and minerals. to run these pathways. So these reactions occur by enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that help reform the molecules to do the desired action. And in the process, like in this case, CO2 will come off as we generate NADH to go to the electron transport chain. But the point of this slide is, without our vitamins and minerals, the respiration or Krebs cycle will not function well. Okay, so macronutrients, protein, carbs, fats, and micronutrients are minerals, vitamins, all very important nutritionally in the diet so that we function well at a cellular level. So what does metabolic flexibility mean? Well, again, we have three sources of food coming in, or three macronutrients, all of which can participate in glycolysis, which is, again, anaerobic respiration to produce ATP. And they can also participate in the Krebs cycle. This is showing entering the mitochondria. And again, CO2, NADH delivers the electrons to the electron transport chain to make ATP. So cytoplasm anaerobic conditions, mitochondria aerobic conditions. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, does not require oxygen. Oxidation is down here again, using oxygen to harvest the electrons. The electrons come from NADH to go to the electron transport chain to produce ATP. Okay, the repetition of this hopefully is starting to come together a little bit. When we talk about metabolic flexibility, it means, for example, if you're a keto diet person, that means you're really running off of fats and low carbs. So as we showed in previous slides, there's a lot of machinery built into the system here, carbon skeletons that need to be readily available, enzymes, minerals. So if you're running off, say you're running keto for, I don't know, 6 months, and now you introduce carbs in the system, there's an adaptation process that needs to occur there to now start burning carbs because your system's wired for burning fat. Same with proteins. If you go to a high protein diet and go to high carb and take out fats, your system's got to rewire itself, which takes time, an adaptation process. So the idea of metabolic flexibility is the idea of really introducing different amounts of these nutrients at different time points in your routine so that you're able to metabolize carbs if that's what's available to you, or fats. Say some dire situation came around, a hurricane hits and your food sources are gone and you need to get into survival mode. That's where these things are built in. They're really more of a prehistoric, when hunter-gatherer cavemen, when they're eating off the land, and when a steak meal is available after they go out and kill a lion, well, they're not going to be able to get lions every day. So this is how our system is built for storage and energy. And the problem today is all the food availability, especially processed food, readily available. So the sugar's constantly coming in. This whole Krebs cycle starts getting bogged down, kind of like a roundabout in a street. If there's too many cars entering, the cycle doesn't get a chance to rest and reset itself, and then problems occur. And this is what metabolic syndrome really starts revolving around: the constant inflow of carbohydrates and glucose level high in the blood, insulin being high, hyperinsulinemia, metabolic syndrome. Excess energy stored as fat. So this gets to the concept of calories in, calories out. If you're taking in more calories than you burn, you're going to store it, and the storage form is fat. If you're taking in less calories than you burn, then you're going to burn it and lose weight. So calories in, calories out. So a little bit about glucose and insulin, because this is the key characters in metabolic syndrome. So insulin activates fat storage pathways. So as glucose comes into the bloodstream, so again, if it's coming in as sugar versus complex carbohydrates take longer to be broken down. Glucose gets released slowly. Whereas if you're eating sugar, it really pops into the bloodstream and spikes your insulin. Insulin works by activating the GLUT4 receptor, and that's how glucose gets into the cell. So insulin is designed to help dispose of glucose in the bloodstream. Remember, we said earlier that glucose in the bloodstream is toxic. It needs to be disposed of. And that's really the main role of insulin. If glucose is constantly present in the bloodstream, like you're taking in food all day long, or processed food, or snacking every hour, your insulin now stays high. And when insulin stays high, you can't burn fat. So the glucose will be stored as fat. As fat gets stored, the fat cells start to grow. The fat cells start outgrowing their blood supply. So without the blood supply, the fat cells get ischemic, which causes inflammation, which causes metabolic syndrome, which causes chronic disease. And that's what we think is going on in society right now with all the chronic diseases, such as heart attack and stroke, being the leader, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, of course, obesity leads to orthopedic problems too, in the joints, just trying to carry the weight around. So the idea of a carbohydrate restricted diet is that you produce, the sugars will be lower, you'll have less insulin in the body, so now you will start changing your motor to start burning fat. Faster glucose release leads to more insulin, which is now storing fat, and you can't break down fat. So insulin needs to be low. So this is one huge take-home message. Insulin needs to be low to burn fat. That's the idea behind low-carb diets. That's the idea between meal spacing. This is why people do intermittent fasting, space out the food. And then one thing here is when you're burning fat as your primary fuel source, ketone bodies become released, and you can actually smell them. So, you know, in my 17 years of competing in bodybuilding, I've done 17 shows, meaning I've gone through 17 diets for prepping, and the diets consist of dropping the carbs so you can burn the fat. Getting on stage for bodybuilding, you want the fat, you know, off your body so you can see the muscles. It's a strange sport, but I like it, but you learn a lot about nutrition. So you're trying to preserve lean mass while you're burning fat. And that's why we start to become, you know, real experts in nutrition. So lowering the carbs is usually the key to burning fat, because you'll use your own fat as a fuel source as opposed to taking in fat from the outside. You'll start burning your own fat when you're low carbs and low calories. But you got to be careful that, because when you lose weight, you'll also lose lean muscle, and lean muscle is an organ, so your metabolic rate will slow. So with weight loss, one needs to be careful, because you'll lose fat mass and you'll lose lean mass. And then the problem is that people will lose the weight, and then they fall off the wagon, fall off their diet, they start eating again, and now they've lost lean mass, so their metabolism has slowed. So when they go back to their old food intake habits, their metabolism now is slower and less able to deal with the food that's coming in, and they actually gain more weight than when they started. That's what we call yo-yo dieting. Everybody that diets like that, fad diets, and falls off and goes on another diet later, most of them go on to ultimately gain more fat and develop metabolic syndrome. So this is really about developing, you know, healthy habits. So let's get back to the biochemistry a little bit. So this is what I spoke about in the intro about how electric we are. So this is the mitochondrial membrane. Remember, the mitochondria is a powerhouse of the cell. And by the way, mitochondria seem to be engulfed bacteria historically. We gain mitochondrial DNA from our mothers only, not from our fathers. So our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell that we've been talking about, where the Krebs cycle occurs, is probably our body engulfing primordial bacteria is how it all started. Anyways, we need to generate this membrane potential across the cell membrane. So hydrogen on the outside will cause a membrane potential of 150 millivolts, which is tiny for each cell. But what this does causes hydrogen. This is what the electron transport chain is right here in yellow. As the electrons flow out of the Krebs cycle, again, NADH donates electrons, and there's these complexes in the mitochondrial membrane that pump out hydrogen so that electrons or the electricity flows through our membranes. Ultimately, oxygen captures the electrons, and then the protons get pumped back in to form ATP through this ATP synthase. So that's complicated. And we'll keep running along this theme. So again, glucose comes in, can be broken down to, this is 6-carbon molecule, gets broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, carbon dioxide goes off during respiration, the Krebs cycle you've seen already, but ultimately this is producing ATP through the electron transport chain or electricity in the cell membrane. By the way, if you take all of our 37 trillion cells and the mitochondria within it, we have about 300 volts per meter in our body, which is equivalent to a bolt of lightning. So we have a lot of electric potential in our bodies. That's just a little aside. So let's look at this again. Krebs cycle. Again, NADH is the proton and electron donor. These are the 4 complexes that sit inside the mitochondrial membrane. These are the electrons flowing in the electron transport chain. The electricity pumps out protons into the intermembrane space, and then it gets pumped through ATP synthase to form ATP as the protons come back in. So this is the electric part of our bodies that helps generate ATP in the presence of oxygen. This is the key player, NADH, that's generated by the Krebs cycle aerobically in the mitochondrion. And this is what ATP synthase looks like. It's actually a motor. As the protons come in, this actually starts to turn like a motor, and then the ATP gets generated down here. It's just, it's mind-boggling, the whole thing, and the scientists that have discovered all this. Just another look at electrons being donated as NADH. This is in the mitochondrial membrane. These are the complexes that pump out the protons, and ultimately the protons come back in through ATP synthase to form ATP. Okay, so ultimately electrons are passed to oxygen, and that's why we need oxygen. Without oxygen, we can't make ATP, and basically we die. All right, so that's the bottom line of why we need oxygen, to produce ATP through the Krebs cycle. Hopefully this is starting to come together a little bit now, and we'll be talking about this more in other videos, and hopefully this will all start coming together. Again, the mitochondria in the cell, the complexes in the electron transport chain, electrons circulating through, the ultimate receptor is oxygen. Here's the ATP synthase. And what I want to show here is the reason electrons flow is there are metals like iron and copper inside of these complexes. And metal basically is a loose, electrons are loosely arranged in the anatomic structure so electrons can flow. So metals hold on to electrons loosely and they can flow. That's why electricity runs through wires. And that's how it runs in us. Okay, so metals form, and these are considered minerals. That's why they're so important in our respiratory process. Now take this slide. Things like cyanide, heavy metals, pesticides. Cyanide actually works on these proton pumps and stops them. So cyanide in the right dose, it will arrest this completely. No ATP is formed and we're dead. So that's how poisons tend to work. Some along the electron transport chain, some in other areas of the system. But if we interrupt this electric current within our mitochondrial membrane, we can't get oxygen to produce ATP. And that's necessary for life. That's the point of this slide. The other thing I want to show here, then the Krebs cycle, not only is it producing ATP for energy, it's also a player, again, that's a carbon skeleton concept of all of our molecules. Things can get reshuffled based on our needs, amino acids, nucleotides as DNA, sugars, all these carbon skeletons and nitrogen can get rearranged depending on the body's needs and demands. And a lot of this goes, the carbon skeletons have to, go through steps in the Krebs cycle, not in the entire chain, but some of the enzymes are co-used, for lack of a better word. So just to show that, again, when the Krebs cycle gets bogged down, it really slows down traffic in our body. And then we get into another concept called mitochondrial stress. So high glucose levels constantly bombarding our mitochondria in Krebs cycle leads to mitochondrial stress. What does this mean? It means that excessive reactive oxygen species are produced, or free radicals. Free radicals are toxic. Free radicals seem to be one of the major players involved in aging and disease. So if our mitochondria are not working well, and you'll start hearing this more in the media as these concepts start coming out, we get sick. So chronic diseases are also related to mitochondrial stress. Okay, the powerhouse of the cell, which produces our ATP. We can't produce ATP, we have no energy, and we just don't do well. Another example of mitochondrial stress, again, the mitochondrion, glucose glycolysis in the cytoplasm, acetyl-CoA entering the Krebs cycle under oxygenated conditions. Again, here's the electron transport chain and our four complexes producing ATP in the presence of oxygen. Again, showing that amino acids or just protein breakdown can also participate in any of these steps. So one thing that we don't want is to break down our protein or our muscle for energy, which is called, gluconeogenesis. So in the cases of starvation, meaning there's no carbohydrates coming in, there's no fats coming in, we start breaking down our own bodies to produce energy. So we'll get in our amino acids from our own structural, usually muscle first, start breaking down our own muscle to break down amino acids so they can go into this mitochondrial system to produce ATP. And then we start becoming frail and decrepit. So all these sorts of things, bioenergetic failure, lead to disease. That's how metabolic syndrome causes chronic disease, or at least we think. So let's shift gears a little bit after I bombarded you with the Krebs cycle and anaerobic and aerobic metabolism, what it means. So hopefully you understand a little better. Why is muscle important? Well, one of the things we mentioned was that it acts as a glucose disposal site. Muscle is an organ. It does all these things. And I'm not going to read them all off, but very important things. And I just want to get to this slide. So muscular strength as a predictor of all-cause mortality. So basically, there are many, many papers coming out. This is a big meta-analysis, so high-quality evidence of 2 million participants, showing that higher levels of upper and lower body muscular strength are associated with lower risk of mortality of all causes, meaning heart attacks, stroke, neurodegenerative problems, cancer. All disease is reduced when we're strong, with strong muscles. So that's the importance of resistance exercise and training. So we all know exercise and nutrition are the key to good health. Well, I'm trying to explain why, so it starts making more sense. Because obviously our population is not following the advice that nutrition and exercise is key to health. Too many people metabolic syndrome. Why am I showing this? This is muscle as a metabolic organ. So in resting muscle, glycogen is how we store glucose. So glucose links up into a carbohydrate called glycogen, or a multi-chain, and it's a storage form in the muscles. So if we're resting, our muscles don't need to contract. We don't need to be actively burning energy. So we take advantage of that and start producing ATP for storage. Creatine and creatine phosphate are an immediate energy source. I'll show you something about that in a second. But look at the central player here. ATP is the energy source. And again, the two, glucose and fatty acids, are the producers of the energy. So if we're resting, we're basically producing ATP, not burning it for energy. Under moderate activity, glucose and fatty acids are being broken down now. So our glycogen, our storage form, gets broken down so glucose can be used as the energy source in the mitochondria to produce ATP. And also fatty acids, again, if there's not a lot of glucose in the bloodstream, we'll start burning fat for energy and lose fat mass. So that's with moderate activity. With peak activity, for example, lifting a heavy weight or running a sprint, this system will only give you a few seconds of energy, meaning you break down your stored glycogen and you use your creatine phosphate. As you break down creatine phosphate to creatine, you can produce ATP. Glucose will now be in anaerobic conditions or glycolysis, and the byproduct of that is lactic acid. So we use anaerobic fuel production or ATP production in a burst of energy. So what's that look like? This is exercise duration, and this is the energy system. So the phosphagen system is that creatine phosphate that I was just telling you about. So let's say the first 10 seconds you start to sprint, you're going to start burning that creatine phosphate as your energy source. That goes away quickly within about 10 seconds. In the meantime, glycolysis or anaerobic respiration. So you're starting to break down glucose in the cytoplasm to make ATP, and that will last for another 30 seconds, and that will plateau. But really what we're depending on, again, is that oxidative phosphorylation, that mitochondrial activity in the presence of oxygen to produce ATP, and that's a slower process to get geared up. So that's why people carb up for activities, so they can go longer even than 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes or 30 minutes, fat starts coming in as a fuel source also under aerobic conditions in the mitochondria. But it's just to show how we burn fuels differently based on our energy needs, and exercise is a classic example. All right, and we're starting to get close to the end. Sorry for going so long here. Lactate. We all know that as we exercise or lifting weights, we produce lactate. That's the burn in the muscles. What I'm trying to show here is that the lactate in the blood can also get recycled. Again, a carbon skeleton gets recycled to make glucose. So all that lactate doesn't get thrown out of the system. It gets repurposed to make glucose. This process is called gluconeogenesis. So we can make glucose, like we said earlier, for muscle breakdown. In that case, the amino acid alanine is the main player in muscle breakdown, where alanine, and I'll show you that slide in a minute, can be used to form glucose. Glycerol is the fat breakdown that can also be reversed to produce glucose. So when we need to make our own glucose, meaning we're not eating glucose on the outside, we can produce that through our own carbon skeletons or macromolecules, just used in different pathways. So again, the versatility of our body. Muscle fatigue is the depletion of metabolic reserves. As we highlighted in that one slide, you only got a few seconds of ATP from creatine phosphate, and glycogen. And if we're not really boned up or trained, we fatigue quickly. And that's what training does. It builds the enzymes, cardiovascular capacity is all done through training. Alanine, we spoke about a second ago. So proteins can broken down into alanine, and alanine can now get converted to glucose. It's just showing you exactly what I said earlier, that proteins can also be used to make glucose. That word again, gluconeogenesis, making glucose from scratch, using our own carbon skeletons or our own amino acids. Just highlighting the versatility of the body. This is just to show how a trained person can actually make more mitochondria. This is an untrained person. So all these black guys are mitochondria. If you want to bone up your mitochondria, that's what training is about. Athletes have a lot of mitochondria and a lot of aerobic reserve or exercise capacity, whereas sedentary people do not have the mitochondrial reserves for high capacity exercise. Okay, so that's what I'm showing here. And then just to finish up, we touched on this a couple episodes ago, the microbiota. And I took this from I love the podcast by the PhDs, the researchers, because they really go into their research and the questions they're trying to answer. So this is a big, big thing right now, the bugs within us. So this is our intestinal lining. These are all the bacteria in the colon, multiple species, again, maybe 100 trillion of them. These are our intestinal cells, and we're lighting them up here, the nuclei of intestinal cells. And this is the mucus lining in our intestines that acts as a barrier or selective barrier from the bacteria to our intestinal cells. So breakdown of this barrier can cause bacteria that we don't want to enter our bloodstream and cause illness and chronic disease. And we are felt to be about 99% bacterial DNA. So that's our microbiome, our genetic information within our bodies is 99% from the bacteria and only 1% from our cells. That's just an amazing discovery. Why is this important? Because the microbiome has now we know that it's, or we're beginning to know that it's integrated in all aspects of human biology. These bugs participate in our metabolism. And there's some crazy studies in mice where they actually had obese mice and skinny mice. They fed them the same amount of calories, but what they did is they transplanted the feces of fat mice into skinny mice to see what happened. Again, they're all eating the same thing. And skinny mice became fat because they had the microbiome now inserted, and these bacteria behave differently. So the point being that these bacteria also participate in our metabolism, and we need a healthy microbiome to be healthy. 70% of our immune system's in the gut, directly, a couple cell layers away from our microbiota or microbiome. So our bacteria also help boost or degrade our immune system, whichever the case may be, depending on the microbial species we have within us. We want microbial diversity to stay healthy. And there's even, evidence now that, for example, a high fiber diet, which is what we want, the insoluble fiber is the food of these bacteria. And the bacteria, in turn, when they digest it, they will produce short chain fatty acids and butyrate and other molecules or cytokines that communicate with our nervous system, which can affect mood, serotonin levels, depression. We'll talk about this more in another slide, but the point is how important we're learning that the bugs within our gut affect all of our biologic behavior. And I'll just finish with this slide, that why do we want to eat complex carbohydrates versus processed sugar? So the folks that eat a high fiber diet, this takes a while to get broken down. It won't get absorbed in the small intestine, meaning glucose is not coming into our system quickly. It has to be metabolized or broken down in the colon, which is where most of our bugs reside, and they participate in the breakdown of fiber. And again, they can produce good factors or good messaging to our body that helps with better glucose control, satiety, meaning the feeling of fullness, improved metabolism and immune system. So a healthy microbiome leads to a healthy human being. Again, we coexist. On the other hand, if you're taking in processed food or sugars, those get absorbed quickly in the small intestine. Remember, the food goes from the mouth to the esophagus, the stomach, to the small intestine, and finally the colon. So if things are getting absorbed in the bloodstream quickly, again, the small intestine comes before the colon. Now what happens? Glucose levels are high in the bloodstream. Insulin stays high. We can't burn fat. So we start storing glucose as fat. Fat cells grow. Fat cells become inflamed. We become resistant to insulin. We develop metabolic dysfunction, which increases inflammation, which causes chronic disease. So hopefully we're coming to the same theme now through these 3 episodes, and we'll just continue to build on these. So I just want to thank the heavy hitters who were able to stay on this. Again, this will be posted on our YouTube channel. And what we're trying to do here in Miami, my main practice in vascular surgery is Miami Vein. I focus on venous disease. This is my gym, ripgym.com, where we have personal trainers, a full traditional gym with all the weights you need for bodybuilding or just any type of resistance training. And Midtown Body is how we're trying to incorporate the practice with the gym through talks like this and helping folks with medication for weight loss or hormone replacement if necessary, but just a medical gym concept. Okay, and again, try and join us on Monday night where we'll talk about diet preps, a more practical talk than this one on how to really prep your food and how to go out to a restaurant and what to order so you're eating wisely and hopefully will not develop metabolic syndrome with weight gain. Thanks again and have a great weekend.